All right. Find my clicker. Here we go. Started in Galatians a little bit. Galatians was a letter written, as we talked about last time, it was a letter written to this region of Galatia, not necessarily an individual church, but to these several churches, this region. And it's Paul's defense of his apostleship, as a lot of Galatians has to do with that. It also has to do with this Judaism and things that are going on with that, and his defense of that. So there's a lot going on here, but he really starts a lot with this idea of his apostleship, right? Of who he is in Christ, his authority to tell them what to do, to them to listen to him. And he talks a little bit here in 6. We started talking about this idea of a gospel, a different gospel, Paul says here. And, I started on that last week a little bit. In a basic sense, the gospel is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's the basic idea. The gospel in the Greek literally means good news. But Paul always uses it in a broader sense, I think. He uses it in the sense of really the whole body of doctrine that encompasses everything. But, what does he mean by a different gospel? And he says not another, right, but a distorted gospel, one that's not necessarily the truth of what Paul preached. So we can distort the message of Christ or distort the gospel. We can make it be what we desire it to be, not necessarily what it is. And when that happens, then, of course, that kind of ruins everything. So the question really becomes, what were they preaching here in Galatia, in this region of Galatia? What was the different gospel that they were preaching? How did they distort it? How did they make it different than what it was? So you have to think a little bit about a lot of what this is about, and that's this idea of Judaism, right? This idea that the Jews were coming in and telling them that, okay, well, you're Christians, but on the other hand, you need to keep these Jewish practices. You need to keep this Passover. Maybe you need to keep the Sabbath. You need to keep circumcision. You need to keep all these other things in order to be saved. The gospel's not enough. You need to do this other stuff. So maybe that was it. Maybe it was addition, right? Need to do more. Need to do this other. Maybe that was the idea here. There's a lot of ways I think that we could do this, and this verse gets used a lot when we talk about false teachers or we try to make that illustration. We use this verse sometimes because Paul was very strong with it. Matter of fact, a lot of scholars say this is some of the strongest wording Paul used in all of his letters. This idea, and he includes himself, doesn't he, in 8. If we are an angel, shall preach to you another gospel, he is to be accursed. And he repeats that statement. And that's why they say this is probably one of the strongest statements that Paul makes in all of his letters. This idea that if you're going to preach something different than what Paul preached or different from the gospel, then you should be accursed. Nobody has the authority to do that. Paul says, I don't have the authority to do that. An angel in heaven doesn't have the authority to do that. So that's really a big statement. But what Paul was trying to tell him here is nobody has that authority. It's not a person. Nobody has the authority to change the gospel. Can't do that. That's really a big statement. So if they don't have the authority to do it, then we don't have the authority to do it. Nobody has the authority to do it. There's only one gospel. The Bible is very clear about that. One thing that was delivered to us, one word of God that was delivered for all times. We're in the last age. God has spoken. It's all done. Can't change it. It's not going to change. It's going to be this way till the end of time. This is the last days. Paul's is really making a really strong statement here that you can't preach something other than what has been preached. Can't preach a different gospel, another gospel, a distorted gospel. And there's a lot, like I said, a lot of ways we can do that. But Paul here probably talking more about Judaizers, about adding to it. You know, that's a big movement today in our society, is this idea of what we would call Messianic Jews, Judaism. And, you know, we think, well, that's done. That's behind us, you know. We don't think about that anymore. You know, there's no Jews around here, really. You know, not something we have to think about. But it's prevalent today, even in Henrietta, America, believe it or not. People that think that we should worship on the Sabbath, people that think we should keep Passover, people that think that we should adhere to the law, to the old things, that's part of us, that we should do that. Scott, that comes on Wednesday night, a lot of y'all like his comment. We really enjoy having Scott here, but Scott asked me if we were going to keep Passover. He said, I saw your table. Do this in remembrance of me. He says, I want to know, you know, if we're going to keep Passover. And I said, we don't keep Passover, but we do take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, you know. And he was kind of interested in that philosophy because he thought we would keep Passover. He really believes, and if you've heard his comments, he really does a lot of Old Testament study, and he's really wrapped up in that thought of that Old Testament and how that applies to us, right? So it's a big thing here. Even in this town, there's a lot of what we would call maybe Messianic Jews. I really don't know if that would be the proper name, but Christians who still think we need to keep pieces of the Old Testament, pieces of the law. Why don't we do that? What do we tell people about? Or the Ten Commandments, you know, we hold them up, we put them on plaques and boards and hang them on our wall. You know, is that still us? Is that who we are, who we're supposed to be? Are we messing up by not keeping this old law? Should we worship on the Sabbath? Should we, you know? What do you think about that? A lot of people really believe it. A lot of people really believe it, really believe that, you know. I even have people in the church tell me, you know, we got to keep them 10 Commandments, right? What do you think about that? Do we need to keep if we need to keep the 10 Commandments, what's one of the 10 Commandments? Remember the what? Huh? Remember the Sabbath. So if you think we need to hold the law, we need to hold them, you know, how big is the law? Right? Is it just 10 Commandments? You know? How many laws did Moses bring down off Sinai? Over 600. Yeah. Over 600 things Moses brought down off Sinai. That's a lot. Jews couldn't keep it. Right? Isn't that what they said? It says they couldn't keep it. Too much to do. You can't. Right? What about us? What do you tell somebody who says we need to worship on Saturday? Or we need to keep the Passover?
There's a verse that says if you keep any of the law, you're no longer under grace, but you're under the law. Grace no longer exists for you.
Right. You got to keep the law, you got to keep it all. Right? Well, we can't do that. We physically can't do that. So, should we worship on Saturday? Why do we worship on Sunday? Is the Sabbath still holy? Yeah, we should do it all, right? But the Jews don't offer sacrifice anymore because there's no temple, right? They're in synagogue worship, so Jews don't sacrifice anymore. Yeah, a little bit. But they can't because according to the law, you know, sacrifice has to be offered on the altar by the priest, you know, has to be offered in the temple or the tabernacle, which no longer exists. There's no temple, right? So there's no sacrifice. You know, when they went into Babylonian captivity, they quit that because the temple was destroyed, and the Jews, there was no synagogue worship until the captivity. But after the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews were carried off into Babylon, they began synagogue worship. they began to worship in what they call synagogues and not in the temple, because the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, so there wasn't a temple. So they went into synagogue worship, and when they did that, they no longer sacrificed. Even on Passover, they don't sacrifice the Passover lamb anymore. They just use a lamb bone. They don't sacrifice the lamb anymore on Passover, because they kind of like, well, and to me that is kind of a pick and choose, that one, but they kind of pick and choose a little bit because the temple doesn't exist anymore. So, so what was Sabbath worship about? Did we always keep the Sabbath? That didn't happen until Moses, right? Before Moses, didn't matter, right? In patriarchal age, there was no day of worship, was no Sabbath. Why did God do that? Why did God, when Moses came down, you ever thought about that? Why did he say on the seventh day? We always tie it back to creation, don't we? God created in 6 days. On the seventh day, God rested. Who wrote Genesis? Moses, right? And who brought the law down? Moses, right? Why did God tell him to rest on the seventh day? Why do you think why did he do that? Jesus said, what did Jesus say about it? He says, is the Sabbath for man or man for the Sabbath? What's the answer to the question? Sabbath for man. Why? Why is the Sabbath for man? Yeah, it's a sacrifice. Gary's right. I've often thought about that. I love God. I do. And I guess if he said, Rex, keep the Sabbath, and I thought that was something I had to do, I would do that. But that would be a day of misery for me in a way, because it wasn't that you just took the day off. It wasn't like the weekend. It was a day of nothing, essentially, right? It was no work, right? No cooking. Where are you going to draw the line on that? I'd just be curious to know. In our society, we live in a lot different world than they lived in.
Romans 14 says one person regards the day above another, and one regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord. So, I know why we do Sunday, because it's our apostolic example. But, things change. We have a new covenant. That means the old is gone and the new is here.
Right. Yeah, we have a new covenant, and the Sabbath doesn't mean to us what it meant. The Sabbath was created for man. I always thought, in my mind, that God brought a bunch of slaves out of Egypt. And I've never been a slave, hopefully never will be. I've been a slave to a few things, but I've never been a slave, technically. But I always thought slaves probably never got a day off. Would you probably imagine that's probably true? I imagine slaves, every day was the same to a slave, I'll bet you. Don't you think? Every day they got up and served their master. Every day. I don't imagine one day meant anything different than the day before it. And I always thought it was fascinating when God called them out of Egypt and he said, you're going to take a day off. And I always thought how foreign that would be to them. To be like, you mean I'm going to wake up one day and not do anything? I think that would just have been a real foreign concept. And hard for them to wrap their mind around, would be me. But God said it's more than just a day off. You're not going to work. You're not going to cook. You're not going to, all these things you're not going to do. And of course, by the time of Jesus, they had really defined that, what it means not to work, right? Sabbath day journey, less than a half a mile. Can't write on paper or on anything. You could write in the dirt, but you can't write on anything else, They had defined it, and they criticized Jesus all the time for it, right? Healed on the Sabbath. Aren't there 6 days to work? Why does he do it on the Sabbath? There was a lot of, Jesus pushed it all the time, didn't he, the Sabbath? He pushed it. And we know Jesus lived perfectly. So if Jesus did the things Jesus did, then he wasn't contradicting God. He was contradicting man, but he wasn't contradicting God. But the church started on what day, right? Church started on Pentecost, right? What's Pentecost? What's Penta? 50. So Pentecost is what? 50 days after Passover, right? So 50 days after Passover, Sabbath. So that would be, Sabbath is what day? Saturday, right? So 50 days, 49 plus 1 would be what? Sunday, first day of the week. Early church started on the first day of the week. The early church met on the first day of the week. We know that from Acts. We know that from Corinthians. We know that from history. Early church met on Sunday, not on Saturday, but on Sunday. Why? Because it was different. It wasn't supposed to be Judaism. It wasn't supposed to be different. Supposed to be new. Supposed to be what it was. So you and I, Jesus Christ, when he hung on the cross, he made a new covenant. The old covenant disappeared. The old covenant was the law. The law, you're going to see this in Galatians. The law wasn't the beginning of God's relationship with man. It was in the middle. The beginning of God's relationship with man was patriarchs. It was Abraham and Jacob and all those guys. It wasn't the law. It was the patriarchs. It was a different time. If you really think about it, which Gary's brought this up a long time ago, and I've always found it interesting, essentially Cornelius was a patriarch. Cornelius was the head of the household that God spoke to directly. Cornelius was kind of a patriarch. Cornelius wasn't a Jew, right? Wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile, but God spoke to him directly. Cornelius, in a sense, was a patriarch. This idea of Judaism, or of the law, was in the middle of all this. It was something that God put in place to get us to Jesus. It was this part of God's ultimate plan, but it wasn't forever. The law was never meant to endure forever. It was never the purpose of it. The purpose of it was to bring us to Jesus. That was the purpose. And it did that. The law accomplished what it should have done. Jesus said, what did Jesus say? He said, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but I came to do what? Came to fulfill it. If you fulfill something, it's done, right? If you fulfill something, it's done. It's been accomplished. That's what Jesus said. He's the end of the law, not the continuation of it. He's the end of the law. For you and I to say, oh, well, we need to keep the Sabbath. If you're going to make that statement, then you need to keep the Sabbath. I mean, if you come to that determination that the Sabbath is a holy day and the Sabbath is the day we're to meet, then you need to keep the Sabbath. And what does that mean? It means no work. It means you need to keep it, right? In other words, it's not just the day that you decide, we need to get together on that day. It's a day that if you're going to keep that Sabbath, you're going to make the Sabbath holy, then you need to keep it holy. You need to keep it all the way. If we're going to take the law, we got to take all the law. Can't just take a little bit of it. We got to take it all. And the truth is that the law was cumbersome. The law was difficult to keep. And personally, I'm glad we don't have to do it. I mean, I love God and everything, but I just don't hardly see how I could keep all that myself. I don't. Not and do it right. I mean, even Passover, my gosh. That's a 2-week adventure, isn't it? I mean, how many of us can afford to lose 2 weeks out of our year to do Passover? It's a big deal. So that's what they were doing here. Paul says, I don't seek man's favor or to please man. If I were, then I would not be a bondservant of Christ. It's interesting in this letter in Galatians. You know, Paul did do things to please men. Would you all agree with that statement? Paul did. Matter of fact, Paul says, I became all things to all men, for perhaps I might save some. Paul did try to please men a lot. He circumcised Timothy because he wanted the Jews to accept him, right? He circumcised Timothy. He kept a vow. He kept a Nazirite vow in Acts. We know he did because he was going back to fulfill a vow. He kept a vow, a Jewish vow in the book of Acts. He went to pay for the ending of a Nazirite vow in Acts because they wanted the Jews to accept him. So he went into the temple to pay for the end of a Nazirite vow for some Jews that were taking a Nazirite vow, or Jewish Christians that were taking a Nazirite vow, because they wanted the Jews to accept him. So Paul did do a lot of things to please men. But then Paul kind of drew a line too and said, I'm not going to do that. You know, when he came to Titus, he said, I'm not going to circumcise Titus because I'm not going to give in to you. But yet he circumcised Timothy, you see. Paul walked kind of a fine line sometimes. But Paul, the deeper Paul got into his ministry, the further along he got, the more he was like, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. You know, I kind of did that to get along, kind of did that to kind of get you guys on board, kind of maybe have a little inroad with you. But if you're going to come to people and say, you got to do this or you're not going to be saved, I'm going to draw a line at that. You know, Paul said, I've got the freedom to do things in Christ, right? But it's not always profitable to do it, Paul said. So he here is saying, I could go along with you. You know, I could kind of go along with this. But he says, I'm not going to do it because you're distorting the gospel. The gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, and neither I received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. This is a big thing for Paul. He says, I didn't get this from a man. I got this from Christ. So these 14 years that Paul was off after his conversion, before he went back in Acts 13, these 14 years that Paul was off, he said, God has revealed this to me. And he's going to make a bigger argument for this. He's going to say, not only did God reveal it, but he says, I went back and talked to these apostles in Jerusalem, and they say I'm teaching the same thing they're teaching. Not only did God reveal it to me, but it's the same thing as the other apostles were teaching, but I didn't learn it from them. I learned it from God. He says, I was a Jew above Jews, right? He says, I was persecuting the church to destroy it. He says it was advancing in Judaism, but beyond my contemporaries and my countrymen, being zealous for my ancestral traditions. And yet, but when God, who had set me apart, even from my mother's womb, called me through his grace, was pleased. 15 is a really interesting verse, I have to say. You know, because why does he say that? Why do you think Paul says, God, who set me apart, even from my mother's womb? What do you think? Who do you think about when you think about that statement in 15? What other person in the Bible? John, right? John the Baptist was set apart in the womb, wasn't he? He was, right? Set apart in the womb. Paul says here, he said, I was set apart, even though I had this foray into Judaism, and even though I persecuted the church, and even though I did all these bad things, God had this plan for me from the very beginning. He was using everything in my life to make me the person that I am today. It's a really huge statement. And I don't know so much that it's a predestinationalist statement. So it's easy when you look at this and you look at what Paul says here that, oh, well, that's a predestinationalist, you know. God called Paul in the womb. Well, the Bible never says that. God called John in the womb. The Holy Spirit filled John in his mother's womb, right? He called John from the womb. But I don't know that's necessarily what Paul is saying here, is that, you know, God predestined me from the womb to go and preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, you can take it that way. But what I look at here is a Moses thing, okay? This is how I look at this verse. It's a Moses thing. So think about Moses, right? Moses was set apart. He was raised by Pharaoh, 40 years in Pharaoh's house, and then he, covered up his murder of the Egyptian, and 40 years in Midian, and then God called him out of Midian to come and take the children of the children of Israelite, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. And when you think about that story, I've always thought that God used all of that life of Moses to prepare him to do what God wanted him to do. He was 40 years in Egypt. The Bible says he learned all the ways of the Egyptians, right? He was educated with the Egyptians, educated. He knew them. He knew what the Egyptians were about. He knew their gods. He knew what they believed. He knew their faith. He knew everything about them. He was 40 years in Midian to spend all that time by himself with a bunch of sheep, which I'm sure has to work on your brain. And to get prepared to lead the lost sheep of the house of Israel 40 years in the wilderness when they wouldn't go where he wanted them to go. And so that was good training. And God used all of his life up to that point, 80 years of his life, to do what God wanted him to do. Paul became the perfect person to do what Paul did because he was a Jew above Jews, educated, the Bible says, at the feet of Gamaliel, trained in all the ways of Judaism. And yet, he would be converted on the road to Damascus. He would become the apostle, not to the Jews, but the apostle to the Gentiles who were fighting Judaism. In other words, what Paul's saying is that God's used everything in my life, the bad, the good, the ugly, everything in my life from my womb, he's used to make me what I am today, used to make me this minister that I am. And I think in our lives, it's just an amazing thing to me because, people always say, well, I'm getting too old, or whatever to do this, or sometimes God uses all of our life experience to get us to some place to do something for somebody that we couldn't have done 20 years before because we didn't have the life experience to do it. You ever thought about that? Life teaches us, doesn't it? Trains us, brings us up. There's things I could do now, talk to people about now, that I could never have done 20 years ago or 15 years ago maybe. I'm changing all the time, growing all the time. God's continually molding us into what he wants us to be, to do, maybe what he wants us to do. Who knows? Maybe it's your time, Maybe 70 or 80 or 90, maybe that's your time. Maybe God's used all your life to get you to that one point where you can do that one great thing that God really wanted you to accomplish. I always liked that thought, because I always like to think that God's never quite done with me, that there's always tomorrow, and that as long as I'm alive, I'm growing, and maybe I can do something for somebody that I couldn't do a few years ago. So, never give up, right? Never quit, because you never know. God might be just at 80 years old, God might have you ready to get it done. I don't know. I don't know how that works in your life, but I always have faith and confidence that, who knows how long I'll live, and, I don't know. But maybe at some point in my life, I'll be ready to do the thing that God really wanted me to get done, and I hope I can get it done, right? Because God's always training us up, and I think it's that way with Paul. Paul was a great, perfect guy, knowledgeable, educated. He was respected with the Jews and would become respected with Christians. He was the guy, the right guy for the job. Yeah, very educated individual and able to do this stuff. So I think it's amazing what Paul says. To reveal his son to me, so I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. That goes back to that period of time where Paul disappeared for 14 years. Paul went to Jerusalem right after his conversion, but they wanted to kill him. So he left for 14 years. He said he went to Arabia, which is where maybe we think he went to the mountain of God, and returned once more to Damascus. And then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, he calls him here, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So basically, Paul here is making his defense. He says, so I didn't have contact with anybody, any of these apostles. I never saw them. I never talked to them. They never taught me anything. I didn't know. They didn't teach me a thing. But then he says, I'm writing to you, I assure you before God that I'm not lying. In other words, he's really trying to tell them, I didn't really talk to anybody, right? He says, I went in Syria, Cilicia, and I still didn't know the apostles, because he's not going to know that until the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. When he goes to Jerusalem, he's not going to ever meet them, because he's in Antioch. And he's going to leave from Antioch. He's not going to go back to Jerusalem. His first missionary journey, he's going to leave from Antioch. He's not going to go back. And then he says, they kept hearing, the one who persecuted is now preaching, and they were glorifying God because of me. And he says, then after an interval of 14 years, that's the 14 years that we're missing, okay? So 14 years pass before he ever goes to Jerusalem with Titus. And that's when we get to Acts 15. So that's when he's finally going to go back to Jerusalem. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach, and did so in private to those who are reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. So Paul says, so I went and met with them guys in private, because I didn't want to do it in public, because I didn't want to make a fool of myself, right, if I was doing the wrong thing. So I went to them in private, and I told them, this is what I've been preaching. This is what God told me. This is what I've been preaching. This is what I've been doing. You know, Paul's already made a missionary journey. He says, this is what I've been doing. And then he says, you know, and in that, they're going to agree with me. So Paul really wants you to know, or see, or wants them to know, that he's really been called by God. Because like I said at the beginning of this, that's his authority. Really been called by God. That's my authority to do that. And then he says in 2:3, he says, but not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So this is where he starts to draw the line in Galatians. You know, he circumcised Timothy because he wanted the Jews to accept him. But now he said, but I'm not going to do Titus that way, because I'm not going to give in to this anymore, to this Judaism idea. Circumcision. You know, that's probably one of the biggest things of Judaism, isn't it? Is that covenant of circumcision that was given to Abraham, and that goes all the way back to the patriarchs. That idea, this is how you know you're God's children, because you're circumcised. Titus wasn't circumcised. I always thought 4 was kind of interesting. They sneaked in to spy out our liberty. That would not happen in today's society, but they lived in a different world, right, than we live in. And so, in their world was a world of public baths. It was a world where men were with each other naked, nude. So they were able to spy that out. And that's exactly what Paul's saying. They went in to find out that Titus wasn't circumcised. They sneaked in to spy out our liberty, to bring us into bondage. So they went to look, and they says, yeah, he's not circumcised. So you need to circumcise him. And Paul said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do circumcision. That goes all the way back to the patriarchs, right? That's pre-law stuff, circumcision. And when he said, I'm not going to circumcise him, what was he saying to them? This is huge, because this goes right back into worshiping on Saturday, right back into keeping the Passover, right back into all those things. When he said, guess what? We don't have to do this anymore. Not going to follow the law. New covenant. Circumcision was a sign of God's what? God's covenant with Abraham. Am I right? That was what circumcision was. If you were a Jew, a Hebrew, if you circumcised your male children on their 8th day, then you were a Jew. That was the physical sign of that covenant with Abraham. when you don't have to do that anymore, Paul just said, I had the authority of an apostle. I was revealed to this by Jesus Christ. I have the authority to tell you what to do. And Paul says, I'm telling you, you don't have to be circumcised anymore. Why? Because what happened to that covenant? It was done away with. That covenant is done. You don't have to do that covenant anymore. Now you got a different covenant. And what's our sign of that covenant? Baptism. Right? We only have 2 Christian sacraments. Baptism, Lord's Supper. That's it. It's 2 physical things we do as Christians. 2 physical sacraments that we do as Christians. Baptism and the Lord's Supper. That's it. Everything else is gone. Don't have to do it anymore. No better example of that than this. If you don't have to be circumcised anymore, you don't have to keep the law anymore. Just how it is. That was the sign that that covenant is done. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I give you a new commandment. Right. Yeah, we have some commands to love the Lord your God and to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love one another. We do have commands. But the only physical sacraments that you and I have, physical sacraments, are baptism and the Lord's Supper. That's the only things physically. Jews had a ton of physical sacraments, didn't they? They had Passover, they had circumcision, they had sacrifice, they had tons of physical sacraments. But we only have 2. So this was a really big thing when he said this. And Paul says, we didn't yield in subjection to them even for an hour, so the truth of the gospel would remain with you. And that really gives you a little insight into how they were perverting the gospel. They were perverting it by wanting them to be circumcised, by wanting them to keep the Passover, by wanting them to keep the Sabbath, by wanting them to do Jewish things. If you can't really read Galatians and not come away with the idea that the law is done. Matter of fact, we get in Galatians 3. I think Galatians 3 to me is one of the most powerful chapters of the entire Bible when it comes to Judaism and comes to our relationship with Christ and who we are with Jesus Christ. Galatians 3 is a powerful passage. And that's where Paul's really going to start laying into this idea of it. But now, he says, but those who have high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God knows no partiality. So we're talking about Cephas, we're talking about Peter, talking about James, talking about maybe John, talking about what we would consider the preeminent apostles, right? He says when those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. So Paul's saying, listen, God told me everything, that what I'm doing is exactly what they're doing. They didn't add anything to what I'm doing or take away. They didn't contribute anything to me. What I received from God is what I passed on to you. That's the true gospel. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ revealed to me. And Paul relies on this throughout his letters. In the Corinthian letter, which we looked at a while back, you know, when Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper, he says, I gave to you what Christ told me. In other words, I got that from Jesus, not from Peter or John or another Christian. Jesus told me about the Lord's Supper. Jesus himself told me what this was. It was his revelation that told me what it was. And he's saying this because more than anything, at the first part of Galatians, Paul wants them to recognize his authority. He wants them to know that I have the authority to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I have the authority to do it. And that's really, really a big statement. We're out of time. So we'll start here next week. Thanks for your time.